Welcome back, everyone, to Jface Games. Today we're talking about one-shots. Recently, I realized that I have a difficult time creating one-shots for other people. I have a way of running games myself. Some of it's ad-lib, some of it's prepped, but my notes that I use are potentially unlegible for other people, or they just don't make sense. And I found this out the hard way when creating my book currently, and I sent off my notes to what would be a one-shot to the editor. And the response was like, no, absolutely not. And I realized, I'm writing this for myself. But how the hell do you write a one-shot for someone else to play? And I've seen other people do this on YouTube channels, but I had to figure it out for myself. So what did I do? Well, the first thing I did was I wrote an article. So this week, I wrote an article on how do you create a one-shot for yourself. Because what I found was my first inclination was to try to create this story, to create this big arcing plot, and what would this story look like? But that's bad because, well, at least I think it's bad because what I found was I was getting into the weeds on a lot of information, and none of it was actually of value in terms of someone else being able to use it quickly. So I had to boil this down, and I spent an entire article coming up with ideas and figuring out what were the things that really mattered to me in a one-shot, besides focusing on things like story arc and plot and these things, which my brain initially started to go to. My brain initially started to go into this idea of, let me watch the Sanderson videos again on story writing and etc. And I found that took me down a rabbit hole that was unproductive. So let's cut to the short of it. And what did I actually kind of find out? Well, these ended up being my questions that I end up asking myself. Let me get rid of this. Spoiler. What's the procedural plot, right? So my first question is, what's the procedural plot and what's a procedural plot? This actually does go to the Sanderson thing, which a lot of books end up having. There's a lot of different types of plots. You have mystery plots, you have romance plots, you have etc. Procedural plots are in essence quests from games, right? It's in essence this idea of, if we skip down here, procedural plots are like the rescue, the build the team, the get to the place, the build the thing, the chase, the escape, the get revenge, right? There's a process that you're trying to go along in order to succeed at whatever the task is. And I like this because it just gives me a nice simple idea about how to potentially conceptualize what I think of as a basic plot, right? Let me try and expand this out because I can't expand it with just clicking. So I broke it down into these categories, right? Is this going to be combat-based, objective-based, time-based, or social and tactical, right? Combat-based, you got to defeat all the enemies. You got to slay a key antagonist. You got to survive a set number of rounds. This is a little bit more for specific encounters, so I'll move this down. But for procedure, what are the big picture things I'm trying to accomplish? We're going to try and rescue this person. We're going to do an escort quest, right? I got to get X to Y. I've got to escort either a person or an item, right? So I focused on what kind of procedural plot am I trying to accomplish here. Next, what are the potential cold opens, right? A lot of books do this, and a lot of games try to focus on you need to start with the action, right? The Alexandrian, which is a great book, or the Lazy Dungeon Master, all of these books that focus on how do you DM quickly, there's a lot of questions you can ask. And so the Lazy Dungeon Master has these questions of what happens, what event, what's the point, where's the action, start as close to action as possible, when in doubt, start with combat, right? A lot of books will say things like, if you present with a puzzle, or if you present with an information sequence that's lacking information or doesn't have a resolution, this sparks curiosity. So this idea of start with a cold open, start right in the action, whatever that action might be, whether it's fighting or not, start there as quickly as possible. Get into it. So I love that. Another thing I want to point out, I forget the gentleman who wrote who did the YouTube video, but they talked about creating a ritual for the beginning of your sessions. I linked it in the article, so if you go to the article, you'll see it there and talking about that. Let me scoot over a little bit. All right, next, this was the big thing, which is just start making a bunch of cool encounters, right? Focus on the encounters, which is what sort of the point of this video was. Instead of focusing on the plot, instead of focusing on the plot, get straight to making kick-ass encounters. And some of the things I want to talk about here, let me move this down now because technically this goes in here, where what I started compiling is a couple different things. One, this is a list of types of encounters, right? The combat-based, objective-based, time-based, social-based, right? So there's a lot of interesting things you can pull here, and I wanted to come up with every encounter should have multiple win conditions. So combine some of these win conditions. They can either defeat all the enemies, or they can escape the hazard in X amount of time, right? Whatever the case might be. Combining those, using a framework like the Epic framework for designing the actual encounter. Epic framework I learned from Kelsey Dion, one of her videos that she was doing about creating a one-shot. And I really liked it. I liked the idea of every encounter should have what is enticing to them, what's building the pressure or building the stakes, what can they interact with in the environment or in the area besides just combat, and then what are the consequences, always having those consequences. And then finally, you couldn't make this list about building awesome encounters without having something from ICRPG. And these are the different room designs. So ICRPG, Runehammer has all these different room designs. You have a barrier room, a detangle room, a locked room, and there's some descriptions here, right? So this combination of things now became really interesting for me as a resource to pull from. And I could randomize these. I could roll some dice to figure out which one of these, all of a sudden roll some dice, and this is an infiltrate a stealthy area, and then you blah, 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 go down the list. But it made it so it was much easier for me to think about how do I bullet point out an encounter. Finally, what's the climactic encounter? So what I started thinking about is that if I make a one-shot, if all they do is the cold open and then straight into the climax, that should be a satisfying experience, right? And I just use all of these sort of same concepts for building an encounter, but I would just probably make it more robust, right? I'd make it more epic, bigger, whereas a lot of these encounters here, I currently am trying to make 6 encounters at a time, and I want to make them short, 30-minute encounters or something simple. But if someone's sitting down for a 2-hour session, they should be able to do, or an hour-and-a-half session, they should be able to do a cold open straight into a climax, and it should feel satisfying. Small transition, right? If they're not, they should be able to do cold open, depending on what happens, grab one of the 6 encounters, which are very streamlined notes, and then building block them, smash them together however you want. Now, sub-questions I have down here that I think are important, that I felt were important. Who are the talkers that I can sprinkle in, right? And the big thing here is that each talker, I just need 2 things. Give them a quirk, give them a motivation. That's it. If I get a quirk and a motivation, maybe one line of dialogue that I can see and read, that then I get into the headspace of that individual, and that one line of dialogue should inhabit that quirk and that motivation. What are compelling complications? This is one of those things that I think is sometimes when I've personally said this on my channel many times, that I have the hardest time with the with consequence type scenario when you're playing. So any game that has a you succeed with consequence, I always have a tough time. So I thought about just pre-genning a couple with consequences beforehand that are specific to that procedural plot or specific to that. So you have them on deck and you can pull from them really quickly. And then I love the idea of MacGuffins. MacGuffins, if you don't know the term from cinema, that is like, Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's the arc. It's the thing you're trying to get, the thing you're trying to find. So I like the idea of putting a MacGuffin into these one-shots, regardless of the type of procedural plot. Putting in that epic little interesting thing or that interesting thing you want to have access to. But that's it. This is my equation now that I'm trying to utilize in the creation of my one-shots for my game. The only other thing I would say that I added in here was for the encounters that I didn't have in this list, is that I've been utilizing the advice from Deficient Dungeon Master, or the Deficient Master on YouTube, who he in essence has his intro for his encounters are one sentence, right? One sentence that has maybe 1 to 2 descriptors and then some form of motion, right? So you have some movement occurring so that you can invoke that motion draws people in, right? So I've been trying to do that. And that's one of those things for me that's been a challenge in terms of writing. Like I'm trying to be concise, trying to be brief. And so that should be, have that little bit of motion, have that little bit of descriptors. And then I'll probably what I do is I list out the environment. This is what you see: environment, to give them things they can play with, give them the toys for their interactions, for whatever they're doing, and then boom, we're into the action. So that's what I'm doing now. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave comments, hit the likes, do the subscribes, whatever the things are the kids are doing nowadays. Hit us up in our Discord channel. We're having a lot of fun in Discord, and I've been doing a lot more on. I've been trying to do more on Patreon and trying to do more on the Jface Games newsletter on Substack. So I'm hopefully going to be putting more out because I want to keep exploring this as I'm kind of working with this, and see if there's a couple more things that I might want to streamline to be able to embed. Mainly, the biggest thing is how do you more satisfyingly tie in backstories of characters into encounters and one-shots and everything like that. I talk about it a little bit in the newsletter, but I really I wasn't satisfied enough. I want to keep going. All right, y'all. Have a good one.